In 1957, inside the vast Moston factory in Manchester, the production lines for one of Britain's most respected domestic objects simply stopped. Ferranti abruptly sold its entire consumer radio division to EKCO. The consequence was immediate. Factory workers who had spent decades wiring heavy chassis watched their production cease. High street service engineers lost a benchmark of reliability. Almost overnight, a prestigious British wireless maker was reduced to a mere badge, pasted onto cabinets built by competitors. A decade earlier, that same name had meant precisely the opposite. It was a symbol of absolute, unbreakable permanence in the post-war sitting room. The paradox is that the Ferranti wireless did not disappear because it failed to hold a signal. It was abandoned because it was engineered too well, built like industrial infrastructure for a retail market that increasingly demanded cheapness over survival. But the real story of Ferranti is not just the story of a 1957 corporate sell-off. It is the story of how a heavy engineering empire built radios like power stations, and why the British high street eventually refused to pay for them. Every week, we tell the stories of British radios, wireless makers, and listening habits that once shaped how Britain heard voices, music, and memory, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place. In Hollinwood, Manchester, in 1922. To understand how Ferranti eventually lost the British sitting room, one must first understand how they conquered it. The name did not begin in domestic leisure. It began in heavy industry. Sebastian Ziani de Ferranti was a visionary of the British electrical grid, an engineer who designed high-voltage alternators and power stations. His company, based in Hollinwood, Manchester, was built on the manipulation of massive electrical currents. In 1922, as the British Broadcasting Company was forming in London and sending its first tentative voices into the air from Savoy Hill, a new domestic market was born. But capturing that signal required a wireless set, an older British term for a radio receiver that brings broadcast signals into the home without a physical program source. The British absence in those early years was not a lack of broadcasting, but a severe lack of reliability. In the early 1920s, British radio was a precarious, fragile habit. Early listeners relied on crystal sets or primitive valve radios, radios that use glass electronic valves to amplify and process signals before the transistor era. These early sets were temperamental. They were often built by hobbyists on kitchen tables, using components that were prone to catastrophic failure. The weakest link in these early circuits was usually the audio frequency transformer, a component that frequently burned out, broke down, or severely distorted the sound of the BBC. A listener in Yorkshire, trying to hear a broadcast from London, did not want a fragile scientific experiment. They wanted an instrument they could trust. Ferranti looked at the failing components of the early British wireless market and applied the unforgiving logic of a power station. In 1922, at their Hollinwood works, the company began manufacturing radio components, most notably their AF series of audio transformers. They did not just build them, they over-engineered them. A Ferranti transformer was encased in a heavy metal shroud, bolted together, and built to withstand stresses far beyond what a domestic radio would ever actually require. The early reception within the British radio trade was immediate and absolute. Enthusiast publications like Practical Wireless and Wireless World praised the components for their indestructible nature. If a British service engineer or a dedicated home constructor wanted to guarantee that a set would not fail, they used a Ferranti transformer. It established a reputation for industrial-grade survival. But supplying parts for other people's cabinets was only the beginning of the ambition. As the 1920s turned into the 1930s, the British listening habit changed. The radio was moving out of the amateur's shed and into the center of the family sitting room. It was becoming domestic furniture. In 1932, the company made its definitive British entry. Ferranti opened a massive, purpose-built facility, the Mostyn factory, located just a few miles from their original Hollinwood site in Manchester. This factory was not built to wind spare parts. It was built to manufacture complete, highly engineered domestic radio receivers. They were no longer just supplying the internal organs. They were building the entire machine, from the heavy steel chassis to the wooden cabinet, the internal wiring, and the loudspeaker operatoire. The part of a radio that turns the electrical signal into sound moving through air. The radios that rolled off the Mostyn production lines in the early 1930s were formidable objects. They were primarily mains radios, sets powered directly from the household electrical supply, rather than relying on cumbersome and expensive glass batteries. Ferranti eagerly adopted the super-heterodyne circuit. A superheterodyne receiver is a highly efficient design that mixes the incoming broadcast signal with a steady, locally generated internal frequency, making it far easier for the set to separate closely packed stations on the dial. This engineering was crucial in the 1930s. The European airwaves were becoming crowded with competing national broadcasters. A British listener needed selectivity, how well a radio separates one station from nearby stations, and sensitivity, how well a radio picks up weak signals from distant transmitters. The Ferranti super-heterodyne sets delivered both with ruthless, unwavering efficiency. They were not cheap. In the mid-1930s, a flagship Ferranti console or table radio could cost anywhere from 15 to 20 guineas. A guinea was an older British unit of currency equating to £1 and 1 shilling, traditionally used for luxury goods and professional fees. At a time when the average British weekly wage was roughly $3, a Ferranti radio was a massive household investment, equivalent to several months of hard labor. But the British high street electrical dealer knew exactly how to sell them. When a customer walked into a local radio shop and turned the tuning dial, the scale or display that shows which station or frequency the radio is tuned to, on a Ferranti set, the physical experience justified the price. The movement was weighted and precise. The chassis hidden inside the cabinet was constructed from thick, stamped metal. The mains transformer, drawing directly on Ferranti's power grid heritage, was massive. These were sets that often required two people to comfortably lift onto a shop counter. They were heavy, immovable, and engineered with a profound sense of permanence. High street dealers loved to stock them because they rarely came back to the repair bench. Once a Ferranti set was installed in a British front room, plugged into the mains, and tuned to the BBC national programme, it simply worked. Year after year. The brand had successfully bridged a massive gap in the British market. They had taken the raw, heavy engineering of the Manchester Industrial Revolution and disguised it inside polished walnut and molded bakelite cabinets. By the late 1930s, the Mostyn factory was employing thousands of workers, churning out tens of thousands of sets for homes across the country. Before it ever faced the threat of cheap imports or the digital shift, Ferranti had established an ironclad contract with the British listener. The badge on the dial was not mere decoration. It was an industrial guarantee about reception. By 1935, Ferranti had stopped being merely a component supplier and had become a dominant, autonomous force on the British high street. The breakthrough that secured this position was not a single technological miracle, but the uncompromising application of heavy engineering tolerances to a consumer object. The definitive expression of this philosophy arrived with the mid-1930s Ferranti Nova and Magna series. Physically, these radios were striking, imposing objects. They were primarily designed as the table radio, a radio designed to sit on furniture rather than be carried in a pocket. To house their massive internal chassis, Ferranti heavily embraced Bakelite, an early hard plastic used for many radio cabinets, strong, moldable, and visually distinctive. But where competing manufacturers often used thin, brittle Bakelite moldings to cut production costs, Ferranti's cabinets were cast thick, heavy, and structurally unyielding. They were designed not just to cover the electronics, but to contain the intense heat generated by a powerful valve radio. A radio that uses glass electronic valves to amplify and process signals before the transistor era. Inside that heavy Bakelite shell lay the true British radio moat. The chassis itself was not merely bent aluminium sheet metal, it was thick, heavy-gauge steel. Mounted securely upon it were the legendary Ferranti audio transformers and massive mains power components. A capacitor. A component that stores and releases electrical energy in a circuit. In a Ferranti set, was notoriously overspecified. Where a circuit required a component rated for 300 volts, Ferranti engineers would frequently install one rated for 600. The tuning capacitor. A component that changes the circuit's tuning so the radio can select one station from many. Moved with a damped, heavy precision that felt closer to a piece of industrial testing equipment than a domestic appliance. This over-engineering solved a critical, expensive problem for the British market: the devastating cost of unreliability. In the mid-1930s, a reliable broadcast receiver was a major household investment. A premium Ferranti Magna model would cost a family between 12 and 15 guineas. In an era when a skilled factory worker might earn roughly $3 or $4 a week, buying a Ferranti required careful, long-term financial planning, almost always facilitated by complex hire purchase agreements signed in a local high street shop. Because of this immense entry price, the British consumer demanded absolute, unshakable dependability. The radio had to capture the BBC regional program from a distant transmitter without fading, and it had to do so every single evening for a decade. Furthermore, the European airwaves were becoming fiercely congested. Listeners wanted to tune into Radio Luxembourg or Radio Normandy alongside domestic broadcasts. This required exceptional selectivity. How well a radio separates one station from nearby stations, and high sensitivity. How well a radio picks up weak signals. The Ferranti superheterodyne circuits delivered both, dragging faint signals out of the noise and locking onto them with industrial stability. The distribution of these heavy receivers required a highly trusted retail network. Ferranti did not sell through cheap catalog mail-order companies in their early breakthrough years. Instead, they built an elite, strictly controlled network of appointed high-street radio dealers. These independent shops, ranging from grand London department store electrical counters to small provincial retailers in Yorkshire and Lancashire, became the critical bridge between the massive Moston factory and the quiet British sitting room. For a high-street dealer, selling a Ferranti was a highly profitable and low-risk transaction. The service network, the shops, engineers, and repair counters that kept radios working after sale, quickly realized that a Ferranti receiver rarely came back for warranty work. Service engineers working on the dusty repair benches of independent dealers deeply respected the brand because the internal layout was logical, spacious, and built with accessible components. When a set did eventually need a replacement valve, a glass electronic device used to control and amplify signals before transistors replaced it, or a new dial lamp, the steel chassis was easy to extract and service. This mechanical reliability earned the enthusiastic, repeated endorsement of the British technical press. Wireless world, The most demanding and technically rigorous of the British radio magazines regularly praised Ferranti receivers for their exceptional audio fidelity and unshakable tuning stability. Practical Wireless, a publication aimed squarely at the keen home constructor and high street repairer, admired the sheer physical quality of the Mostyn-built chassis, often noting that Ferranti sets were built to outlast the furniture they sat upon. At the same time, domestic listeners discovered the aesthetic and physical appeal of the sets. The grille, the opening or fabric-covered area through which sound leaves the radio cabinet, on a Ferranti, was often styled with bold, confident Art Deco geometry. When a listener grasped the tuning dial to search for the new Droitwich transmitter, or adjusted the volume control, the knob or slider that changes the loudness of the sound, the physical resistance of the controls conveyed a profound sense of mechanical seriousness. The sound that emerged from the internal loudspeaker was rich, warm, and utterly dominant in a quiet room. By the end of the 1930s, the Mostyn factory was running at staggering capacity, churning out hundreds of thousands of receivers for a country that was increasingly eager to hear the escalating news from Europe. The company had successfully convinced the British public that a radio should not be a fragile novelty, but a permanent, heavy household utility, as reliable as the electrical grid itself. The badge on the dial was not decoration. It was a promise about reception. The Second World War had pulled Ferranti away from the domestic high street and thrust it deeply into military radar, cathode ray tubes, and high-stakes communications. But when peace returned to Britain, the Mostyn factory pivoted back to the consumer market with a terrifying industrial momentum. The late 1940s and early 1950s represented the absolute zenith of the Ferranti domestic radio empire. They were no longer just a respected northern manufacturer. They were an inescapable, commanding presence in the post-war British sitting room. By 1950, the Ferranti operation in Manchester was staggering in its scale. The company employed over 8,000 people across its various divisions, with the Mostyn plant serving as a colossal, self-contained engine of electronics. The assembly lines did not just build radios. They built the complex testing equipment that calibrated them, the massive transformers that powered them, and the heavy steel chassis that held them together. The women and men on the Mostyn production lines had spent the war years wiring critical radar receivers and aircraft instruments for the Ministry of Supply. When they returned to building domestic sets, they applied the exact same military-grade soldering and wiring standards to consumer goods. Chelmsford built the idea of wireless. Droitwich carried the national signal. Broadcasting House gave it a voice. But Manchester built the physical infrastructure that pulled it out of the air. In the years immediately following the war, the British public was desperate for domestic comfort and stability. The focal point of this new peacetime existence was the Light program, a BBC national radio service established in 1945 to provide light entertainment, comedy, and music, serving as an essential relief from the grim austerity of national rationing. To hear comedies, evening dance bands, or the football results, families gathered around the fireplace. The radio was the unblinking, glowing eye of the room. Ferranti understood that this post-war market wanted more than just a small utilitarian box. They wanted permanence. This era marked the golden age of the radiogram. A substantial piece of wooden furniture combining a radio receiver, an internal audio amplifier, a large loudspeaker, and a record player within a single highly polished cabinet. Ferranti's radiograms and premium console sets were monumental objects. A model like the late 1940s Ferranti 147 was built into a heavy walnut veneer cabinet that dominated a front room. When the heavy lid was lifted and the internal dial illuminated, the listener was greeted by a massive glass tuning scale, deeply etched with European city names that had so recently been unreachable battlegrounds. Hilversum, Kalundborg, Paris, Luxembourg, and London. High-street electrical shops and independent radio dealers fought relentlessly to secure Ferranti distribution rights. In shop windows from Glasgow to Cornwall, the Ferranti badge was displayed as a mark of absolute engineering prestige. A high-street dealer knew that selling a Ferranti radiogram or a premium table receiver was a highly lucrative, entirely safe transaction. These sets were so heavily over-engineered that they almost never required warranty repairs. A service engineer working at the back of a local radio shop rarely saw a post-war Ferranti return with a burned-out power supply or a failed resistor, a component that limits or controls the flow of electrical current. To own one of these receivers was a statement of serious intent. In 1948, a high-end Ferranti radiogram could cost upwards of $60. At a time when the average British weekly wage hovered around $6, this represented a massive financial commitment. Families purchased them through complex hire purchase agreements, carefully logging weekly payments in small paper books kept beside the radio itself. The heavy wooden cabinet was dusted with reverence. The radio times sat neatly folded on top of it. It was the mechanical heart of the household, expected to outlast the very furniture it sat upon. The physical act of using one of these sets became a deeply ingrained domestic ritual. A Ferranti control knob did not turn with a cheap, lightweight snap. It rotated with the smooth, damped resistance of a piece of laboratory equipment. The sound that rolled out of the heavy wooden cabinet, driven by an oversized internal speaker, was warm, authoritative, and impossibly stable. Ferranti was not merely a consumer radio. It was an industrial guarantee of reception in a country where the weather and the airwaves were equally unforgiving. By the time the Rotham transmitter in Kent began beaming the first official BBC VHF-FM broadcasts to the British public in 1955, the Moston factory was operating at an astonishing industrial peak. The introduction of VHF-FM, a radio band that gives clearer sound over shorter distances than older AM bands, demanded a new level of tuning precision and circuit stability that many budget manufacturers struggled to achieve. Ferranti, with its deep legacy of military radar and heavy power grid transformers, found this rigorous new high-fidelity standard effortless. Inside the Moston Works, the domestic television and radio division had grown into a sprawling, self-contained empire of electronics. Industry estimates suggest that, by the mid-1950s, the broader Ferranti organization employed over 12,000 workers across its northern sites, with the Moston consumer lines running relentless shifts to fulfill national orders. The scale of the operation was absolute. Ferranti did not simply assemble generic components sourced from cheaper overseas suppliers. They manufactured their own heavy-duty capacitors, wound their own colossal mains power transformers, pressed their own thick steel chassis, and constructed their own rigid wooden cabinets. For the independent British radio dealer, the arrival of a new Ferranti product line was a major commercial event. Shop windows in high-street electrical retailers, from Bradford to Bristol, and from Oxford to Glasgow, proudly displayed the bold Ferranti badge. In the intensely competitive environment of the 1950s British High Street, where brands fought bitterly for the attention of passing shoppers, a Ferranti receiver stood entirely apart. It was never the cheapest option on the shelf. It was never the most fashionable, lightweight, or frivolous design. Instead, it was sold on the uncompromising promise of sheer physical survival. This reputation was heavily reinforced by the service engineers who staffed the dusty repair benches at the back of those very same local radio shops. A technician reading "Practical Wireless," or the service manuals of the era, knew that if they sold a customer a heavy Ferranti charge table radio, a radio designed to sit on furniture rather than be carried in a pocket, they would likely not see that set return for a decade. While other manufacturers were experimenting with early, fragile, printed circuit boards, a board carrying electronic components and copper tracks that connect them, to cut labor costs, Ferranti sets still relied heavily on immaculate, hand-wired tag boards that could withstand decades of intense heat from the glowing glass valves. The cultural peak of this heavy engineering arrived in the quiet British sitting room of the mid-1950s. At exactly 6:45 p.m., a family might gather around a massive Ferranti console to hear The Archers on the BBC Home Service. The listener would adjust the tone control, the control that changes the balance of bass and treble, to suit the broadcast. The large internal loudspeaker pushed warm, resonant air through the thick fabric grille, and the room filled with an authority of sound that smaller, cheaper radios simply could not replicate. The heavy tuning scale, illuminated by warm dial lamps, glowed like the dashboard of a luxury motor car in the darkened room, pulling in signals from a carefully strung outdoor aerial, a wire, rod, or internal component that receives radio waves from the air. This was the pinnacle of the British listening ecosystem. The BBC provided the trusted national voice. The high street dealer provided the local service network. The Moston factory provided the indestructible hardware. For the British family gathered in a 1950s sitting room, a Ferranti radio was not merely a consumer purchase. It was a permanent installation of domestic infrastructure, guaranteeing that the voices of London would never be lost to a failing component or a fractured chassis. It was a perfect agreement between the weight of Manchester steel, the clarity of the BBC signal, and the quiet safety of the post-war home. Every dial, every room, every voice. But that agreement relied on an economic reality that was about to fracture. The Ferranti radio division had conquered the sitting room by building consumer electronics exactly like they built power stations. In the late 1950s, the British high street retail market suddenly decided it no longer wanted to pay for a power station. It only wanted a radio. The decline of the Ferranti radio empire did not begin with a catastrophic failure of engineering, nor did it start with a sudden loss of public trust. The sets leaving the Moston factory in the mid-1950s were as formidable and reliable as they had ever been. But the British radio market is structurally ruthless. It does not reward engineering for its own sake. It rewards the delicate balance between manufacturing cost, high street retail pricing, and changing consumer habits. Ferranti was ultimately destroyed in the British sitting room by two overlapping systemic pressures. Force 1, the escalating British component, labor and manufacturing costs, and Force 5, a profound technological and listening culture shift. To understand the collapse, one must examine the fundamental philosophy of the Moston factory. Ferranti built radios like heavy industrial infrastructure. But by 1956, the cost of manufacturing infrastructure for the domestic market had become entirely unsustainable. The heavy-gauge steel chassis, the oversized mains transformers, and the complex hand-soldered tag boards required an immense, highly skilled, and increasingly expensive British labor force. Every valve, a glass electronic device used to control and amplify signals before transistors replaced it, and every capacitor, a component that stores and releases electrical energy in a circuit, was rigorously tested and overspecified. While this guaranteed that a Ferranti E2 table radio, a radio designed to sit on furniture rather than be carried in a pocket, would last for decades, it also meant the profit margins on each unit were razor-thin. Competitors were beginning to ruthlessly cut costs. Other British manufacturers were adopting fragile, early printed circuit boards. A board carrying electronic components and copper tracks that connect them, which allowed semi-skilled workers to assemble radios much faster and cheaper. Ferranti, bound by its heavy engineering heritage, resisted this cheapening of the internal architecture. They continued to build for permanence in a market that was increasingly pivoting toward disposable convenience. Simultaneously, the British listening habit was fundamentally shifting. The era of the massive, dominant radiogram. A piece of furniture combining a radio, amplifier, loudspeaker, and record player in one cabinet was beginning to peak. The British public no longer wanted a single, heavy wooden monument in the front room. The housing boom meant families were heating more rooms, and listeners wanted smaller, lighter radios for the kitchen, the bedroom, and the workshop. The looming threat of the transistor, a small electronic component that controls or amplifies signals with less heat and power than a valve, was already visible on the horizon. Transistor radios would soon make the wireless set entirely portable. Ferranti's immense expertise lay in managing high voltages, heavy currents, and massive heat dissipation. They were not a nimble plastics manufacturer, and they were fundamentally unsuited to producing cheap, lightweight, battery-powered novelties for a teenage market. Furthermore, the high-street retail landscape was tightening. The rapid expansion of radio rental, a business model where customers rented radio or television equipment rather than buying it outright, meant that the buyers were no longer just families. They were large corporate rental chains like Radio Rentals and Rediffusion. These companies bought televisions and radios in tens of thousands, demanding aggressive bulk discounts. Ferranti's uncompromising, expensive production methods made it exceedingly difficult to compete in these ruthless, high-volume, low-margin commercial tenders. But the fatal blow to Ferranti's consumer radio division came from within its own boardroom. While the Moston factory was fighting for pennies on the high street, the parent company was operating on a vastly different scale. By the mid-1950s, Ferranti had become a towering giant of the Cold War military-industrial complex. They were building radar systems for the Ministry of Supply, developing guidance systems for the Bloodhound surface-to-air missile, and pioneering the world's first commercially available general-purpose computers, like the Ferranti Mark I. When the board of directors looked at the company ledgers in 1956, the disparity was glaring. The domestic radio and television division required huge amounts of factory floor space, thousands of workers, and a massive sales and service network, all to generate a fraction of the profit brought in by a single Ministry of Defense aviation contract. Building a wooden box to receive the BBC Light program had simply become a distraction from building early mainframe computers and fighter jet avionics. The British turning point arrived with brutal corporate efficiency. In 1957, Ferranti made the abrupt decision to exit the domestic consumer market entirely. They did not slowly wind down production. They amputated the division. The entire radio and television business was sold to EK Cole Ltd, the massive, highly efficient radio manufacturer based in Southend-on-Sea. The retreat was absolute. Inside the Moston factory, the domestic radio assembly lines were halted. The heavy presses that had stamped out radio chassis for 25 years fell silent or were retooled for military contracts. The skilled men and women who had wired the post-war sitting room sets were moved on to defense electronics or let go. The physical connection between Ferranti engineering and the British listener was severed in a matter of months. However, the Ferranti name did not immediately disappear from the high street shop window. EK had purchased the brand precisely because it still commanded immense respect among British consumers and service engineers. What followed was a classic tragic case of British brand dilution. The weakening of a brand when its name appears on products that no longer match the original identity. The radios that appeared in catalogs and department stores bearing the Ferranti badge from 1958 onwards had never seen the inside of a Manchester factory. They were pure badge engineering. An EKCO radio, designed in Essex, built with EKCO components, would simply have a Ferranti logo pinned to the front grille. The opening or fabric-covered area through which sound leaves the radio cabinet. The heavy, indestructible power station engineering that had defined the brand was gone. The badge on the tuning dial, which had once been a cast-iron promise of Manchester reliability, was now merely a marketing sticker designed to extract a few extra pounds from a loyal, unsuspecting high-street shopper. The original Ferranti radio was dead. Only the ghost of its reputation remained on the shelf. The radios sold under the Ferranti name in the late 1950s and early 1960s were not inherently bad receivers. EKCO was a highly competent, immensely experienced manufacturer. But the unique, indestructible Manchester DNA was entirely absent. A Ferranti set was no longer a heavy mains radio, built like a piece of industrial infrastructure. It was simply a standard EKCO chassis, fitted with a slightly different plastic tuning dial, and a different logo pinned to the front grille. This strategy of badge engineering deeply confused the traditional British consumer. A family returning to a high-street dealer to replace their beloved 1948 Ferranti radiogram expected to find heavy walnut veneer, massive internal transformers, and a cast steel chassis. Instead, they were offered lightweight veneered particle board and standard mass-market electronics. The physical weight of the controls was gone. The volume control, the knob or slider that changes the loudness of the sound, no longer turned with laboratory precision. It felt cheap, lightweight, and entirely ordinary. Simultaneously, Force 4 and Force 5 arrived with devastating speed. By the early 1960s, the British listening habit was undergoing a radical, irreversible fracture. The family no longer gathered around a single, glowing table radio in the front room to listen to the BBC Home Service. The introduction of the transistor radio, a portable radio that uses small semiconductor devices instead of valves, making it lighter, cooler, and more battery-friendly, destroyed the monopoly of the sitting room. The market was suddenly flooded with cheap, brightly colored transistor sets, imported from Japan and Hong Kong. These sets relied on a small ferret rod aerial, a small internal aerial often used in portable radios for medium-wave reception, and they did not require an external wire strung across the garden. Teenagers took them into bedrooms to listen to Radio Luxembourg. Mothers placed them on kitchen counters to hear early morning broadcasts. The radio had become a personal, highly portable, and ultimately disposable object. Ferranti's brand identity, built on permanence, heavy engineering, and sitting room dominance, was completely incompatible with this new lightweight era. When EKCO attempted to market small transistor portables bearing the Ferranti badge, they were competing against aggressive Japanese manufacturers who could produce similar sets at a fraction of the cost. The British sets were outpriced, outmaneuvered, and structurally out of date. The traditional independent high-street radio dealer, the man who had enthusiastically sold Ferranti sets in the 1930s because they never broke down, was also being systematically squeezed out of existence. The British retail landscape was shifting toward large discount electrical chains and mass-market catalogs. These new retail giants cared only about high volume and low prices. They had no interest in explaining the nuances of British engineering or the benefits of a heavy tuning capacitor, a component that changes the circuit's tuning so the radio can select one station from many. Furthermore, the expansion of radio rental, A business model where customers rented radio or television equipment rather than buying it outright meant that the buyers were increasingly massive corporate rental chains. These chains demanded absolute minimum pricing, stripping away the premium margins that had once sustained British manufacturing. The corporate consolidation of the British radio industry accelerated the final erasure of the brand. In 1960, the struggling Ikiko Group merged with Pi, the massive Cambridge-based electronics manufacturer. The Ferranti badge was now just one of dozens of legacy names managed by a sprawling, unfocused corporate conglomerate. The badge was 2 steps removed from the Mostyn factory, pasted onto sets that had no connection to Manchester whatsoever. By 1966, the Dutch electronics giant Philips took effective control of the Pi Group. The rationalization that followed was swift and unsentimental. Philips did not need the Ferranti name to sell domestic radios. They already possessed a commanding global brand of their own. In the late 1960s, the Ferranti badge was quietly, unceremoniously retired from domestic audio equipment. There was no grand announcement in the technical press. There was no final, commemorative receiver. The name simply ceased to appear in the autumn catalogues. Back in Manchester, the parent company continued to build advanced military radar, avionics, and early mainframe computers, completely detached from the high street. The Mostyn factory workers, who had once wired the heavy radiograms, were long gone or reassigned to classified defense contracts. The domestic listening market had demanded cheapness, portability, and convenience, and the heavy engineering of the North had simply refused to comply. The slow decline suddenly became an absolute silence. The Mostyn assembly lines stopped. The heavy chassis were forgotten. The high street dealers closed. The service benches emptied. The catalogues dropped the name. The badge vanished from the window. The sitting room went quiet. The ultimate death of the Ferranti name was one of the most spectacular and scandalous collapses in British industrial history. But it had nothing to do with domestic radio. Long after the Ferranti badge had vanished from the high street shop window, the parent company continued as a towering giant of military electronics and defense contracts. Then, in 1993, following a devastating and highly publicized financial fraud involving the acquisition of an American contractor, Ferranti International went into catastrophic receivership. The company was brutally broken up, its assets sold off, and a name that had defined Manchester heavy engineering since the 19th century was completely erased from the corporate register. But in a strange, quiet irony, the Ferranti name did not completely disappear. It survived exactly where it had begun, in the hands of British radio enthusiasts. Today, the secondary market for vintage electronics, operating through eBay, Gumtree, and specialist vintage radio fairs across the country, treats the Mostyn-built Ferranti receivers with profound, enduring respect. Members of the British Vintage Wireless Society and amateur radio clubs do not actively seek out the cheap, badge-engineered sets of the late 1950s. Instead, they hunt tirelessly for the heavy, uncompromising valve radios. Radios that use glass electronic valves to amplify and process signals before the transistor era, built between 1932 and 1955. When a modern collector or restorer finds a 1930s Ferranti Nova or a massive post-war radiogram in a house clearance or a charity shop, they know they are acquiring a surviving piece of industrial infrastructure. The original service network, the shops, engineers, and repair counters that kept radios working after sale, may be entirely gone, but the radios themselves stubbornly refuse to die. A restorer working on a dusty repair bench today, perhaps documenting their progress on a UK vintage radio forum or a YouTube restoration channel, will often marvel at the sheer physical resilience of a Ferranti chassis. The thick steel shows minimal rust. The heavy bakelite, an early hard plastic used for many radio cabinets, strong, moldable, and visually distinctive, rarely suffers from the heat warping that plagues lesser brands. There is a specific, functional reason why these original sets still matter so deeply to the preservation community. An old British radio with a newly replaced capacitor, a component that stores and releases electrical energy in a circuit. And a carefully cleaned dial can do something that a modern, disposable smart speaker or an internet radio app cannot. It makes listening feel tangibly attached to physical effort. The listener cannot simply shout a voice command across a room or tap a preset button on a glass screen. The act of tuning a heavy Ferranti requires the listener to physically grasp the knob, watch the mechanical needle glide slowly across the etched names of European cities, navigate the crackling static, and mechanically meet the broadcast signal halfway. It is a physical agreement between the listener, the aerial, a wire, rod, or internal component that receives radio waves from the air, and the machine, governed by the unyielding weight of Manchester engineering. Yet, the physical site where that engineering happened has vanished. If you travel to Moston, Manchester today, and look for the colossal factory that once employed thousands of local workers and churned out the most reliable radios in Britain, you will find nothing. The vast industrial sheds, the heavy presses, the testing laboratories, and the long assembly lines were completely demolished. The site was swallowed by relentless urban redevelopment, replaced by modern housing estates, ordinary streets, and generic business parks. There is no grand monument to the millions of receivers that left those gates, nor to the men and women who wired them. There is, however, one unexpected footnote to the Ferranti radio story. The legendary audio transformers, the heavily shrouded, over-engineered components that Ferranti first built in the 1920s to fix the unreliability of early British wireless, have outlived almost everything else. Today, original Ferranti AF series transformers are fiercely sought after by high-end audiophiles and custom amplifier builders globally. A pair of these 90-year-old components can change hands for hundreds of pounds online. The parent company that built them is bankrupt. The factory is a housing estate, and the BBC broadcast standards they first carried are lost to history. But the physical components are still faithfully transferring sound, completely indestructible. Ultimately, the story of Ferranti Radio reveals a harsh, enduring truth about the British consumer market. It highlights the vast, tragic gap between what Britain claims to value and what it actually rewards. The public romanticizes durability, honest engineering, local manufacturing, and products that can be repaired and handed down through generations. But when standing at the counter of a high-street electrical shop, the retail market consistently rewards lowest price, immediate convenience, novelty, and the illusion of constant progress. Ferranti built radios that were designed to last a lifetime, operating in a retail economy that fundamentally required them to be replaced every 5 years. They did not fail because they were poor engineers. They failed because they refused to compromise their engineering for a cheaper world. Somewhere in a quiet British sitting room, or sitting on the back of a cluttered workshop shelf, a Ferranti receiver still exists. It is heavy, imposing, and completely out of step with the digital age. But inside its thick wooden cabinet, the heavy steel chassis remains perfectly intact, its dial lamps waiting for an electrical current, its massive tuning wheel completely silent, just waiting for a hand to turn the knob and pull one more voice out of the air. See you in the next one.